Up until this point in this area of study, we've been really focused on the relationship between audiences and the media in terms of agency and control. Now we start to look at the way in which governments actually get involved in controlling that relationship. Governments do this through regulation, and a key knowledge from the study design is that you need to know the rationale for regulating the relationships between the media and its audience in Australia. Now, when we're looking at this word rationale, it just means the logical reasons for regulating. So why does the government get involved in this relationship? So media regulation for us is where any media content is controlled or guided by bodies or institutions other than the media creators themselves. So for us, we're really looking at governments here, but there could be other independent bodies or institutions that also are involved in the regulation process. So it includes things like ownership, content control, as well as how audiences can have access to media products. So when we're thinking about this rationale for regulating, there are some key principles that really underpin regulation in Australia. So these things are that the assumption that some people in society need to be protected from harmful content. That, even though we've looked at theories that say that the media has a lot of power and other theories that say that the media has no power, the assumption that the media has some power in some circumstances and that some audiences in society are perhaps more vulnerable or susceptible to that influence, that's what guides the reason for having regulation. Finally, a key principle is that because media institutions are large and profitable, they have both rights and responsibilities. So they need to be responsible for their place in society because they are such an important aspect of it. So from these key principles come some more really specific reasons that form part of the regulation rationale. The first one is the need to protect vulnerable audiences. So while the nature and extent of media influence continues to be debated, so through those theories that we have previously studied, many people agree that the media has the potential to have harmful influence over some members of society. Media regulation exists to protect these vulnerable audiences who might be susceptible to the influence of the media. Now, when we're talking about vulnerable audiences, they can be classified with some key characteristics. So vulnerable audiences in terms of the media are people who can't tell the difference between fiction and reality, people who perhaps scare easily and that kind of fear affects them mentally. They might lack emotional intelligence, and they might see something in the media and then engage in copycat behavior. So when we're thinking about these characteristics, one particular audience comes to mind. We are talking about children. And even though these gifs from The Simpsons are somewhat humorous, they highlight that rationale for regulation, that fear of won't somebody please think of the children, so that the media might have some show them some harmful materials like violence or like sex in front of the children, and that might have an influence there. So it's important to know that this is a really key reason for regulating the media is to protect the innocence of children audiences. The second reason is that the media in what they show needs to uphold community standards, that the government has the responsibility to make sure that these things that our society hold to be true and important are upheld. So although regulation aims to protect audiences from the media, it does also seek feedback from the audience in order to gauge what is and is not acceptable in society at the time. And while there's a general appreciation that informed adults can make appropriate decisions about what they do with the media, that there should be some limits placed on the content that is distributed to the public. So this is typically content that is extreme or grossly contradicts fundamental society standards. So we're talking about exploitation of children. We're talking about the promotion and glorification of terrorism, things like that, that our society really is strongly positioned against, that those standards should be upheld in the media. And it's this fine balance, because we do want freedom of expression and be able to say things, but there are certain things that I think we can all agree are and should be kept off limits. And again, a key thing there is depictions of sexual violence or depictions of the exploitation of children. A third concrete reason for regulating the media is that recognition that the media might be powerful and to limit that power. So previously, and still to this day, Australia has some ownership and diversity laws that are enforced upon the media. Now, these have recently changed. So previously, the 75% reach rule and the 2 out of 3 rule meant that we were guaranteed in each sort of region in Australia to have a variety of media voices. And that was aimed at making sure that the media did not gain too much power. We have recently seen changes to this. A contemporary example is Fairfax newspapers and Channel 9 joining forces to become one big sort of media company. So that infringes a bit on the 2 out of 3 rule. But the idea for us is that a media monopoly is a bad thing, because it might lead to bias in the news. If one person owns all of the media in an area, they can really push their own personal biased agenda on audiences. And then a final reason is to promote cultural identity. So we have rules in Australia for commercial television and radio networks to ensure that there is a certain amount of Australian content. So these are called the content quotas. So a TV network needs to make sure that they are maintaining and supporting Australian stories and supporting the Australian industry by having a certain amount of programming that is locally made and reflects Australian culture on their networks. So on the main channels, 7, 9 and 10, they need to include 55% Australian content from 6 AM until midnight. They also need to produce a range of first-run dramas based on a point system. So it's not just the content quotas are not just in terms of percentage, but it's the types of programming too. So it needs to be first-run or new dramas based on the point system, which includes things like the amount of hours, as well as the prominence given on the network. So there's no point in having just a whole bunch of hours if it's going to only be shown at 2 AM when nobody's watching TV. It also includes things like the amount of jobs that are created and sustained to make sure that the local media industry, particularly the production industry, is being supported by local networks. So these are the reasons for having regulation in Australia, and the way in which they're enforced is laws and policies of the Australian government, as well as self-regulation by media institutions, define the mainstream standards through regulatory bodies and codes of conduct. Now that is a quote directly from the study design, so you do need to know that these two forms of regulation work to define mainstream standards, so as we said before. And so when we are looking at regulation, there are three main types. So there is government regulation, which can be defined as a system by which the government establishes independent bodies to enforce laws and legal obligations over the media industry. An example that we will look at is the Classification Board. We also have industrial regulation, and it's a system by which a section of the media industry themselves set up voluntary rules and standards of practice. Typically, they create a code of practice and appoint an independent body to enforce them. So an example which we have looked at in Year 11 is the Advertising Standards Bureau. They work because all advertisers contribute a small percentage of their budgets to fund the Advertising Standards Bureau, and they keep everybody in check. Okay, it is not just an individual advertiser looking after themselves and making sure that they stick to rules that they set themselves, but it's this industry body that looks after everybody. And then finally, we have self-regulation, which is a system by which individual media organisations set and administer their own codes of practice. So this is not where a whole bunch of organisations group together, but instead individuals set their own code of practice. And then those who use that individual service must agree to the terms of these. So an example that we will look at is YouTube's community guidelines. YouTube as the organization set the rules, and then anybody who wants to upload and interact, comment on YouTube needs to stick by these rules. So in the next video, we are going to focus just on government regulation. So just to give a really broad overview of how these three different types of regulation work in Australia, we have at the very top, overseeing all media regulation, is ACMA. And now ACMA is a government appointed body, and they oversee everything that goes on in terms of media regulation in Australia. So you can see here the pink is the Classification Board and Classification Review Board, which is a government regulatory body. The things in yellow, like Free TV Australia, the Advertising Standards Bureau, they are the industry regulatory bodies. So all commercial radio networks in Australia, so Fox FM, KISS, etc., all grouped together, and the Commercial Radio Australia overlooks their regulation. As far as the internet goes, ACMA does have some control over regulating the internet, particularly when it comes to incredibly sensitive material, such as any sort of communication when it comes to terrorism or anything with child exploitation. But for the most part, the internet is regulated by individual websites themselves. So we said previously that YouTube looks after their own site, and that's the case for Facebook and the other social network platforms, as well as individual websites. So I'm going to go quickly over ACMA. The Australian Communications and Media Authority oversees all areas of Australian media operations and practices. So they're the ones who issue the licenses for TV and radio stations. They administer media ownership and control rules. However, they do promote self-regulation. So they are quite adamant that the media industry should be able to regulate themselves. However, when they fail to do so, ACMA, as the highest authority, can overrule. So even though we're talking about Australian industry regulation and Australian self-regulation, ultimately ACMA does have the final say and can step in as a government authority and impose laws and rules over the media in these areas. So when we are thinking about the media in Australia and regulating, we need to be able to find that, okay, there are some really great rationales and reasons in principle as to why we need to regulate the media, but it hasn't worked out perfectly. And a key knowledge from the study design is that there are issues and challenges relating to regulation and control of the media. We can see these in Australia itself, as well as regulating media overseas. So one of the big issues with government control of the media is that because they're the highest authority, there is the risk of governments getting too much control. And there is a great fear in our society that if the government controls the media, then they could use that power to silence media services that oppose or criticize the politicians in power, or use media services, promote media services that are only those that are aligned with their political ideologies. We can see a little bit of this happening in America over the last couple of years with President Donald Trump really pushing the line of fake news and even saying things like the mainstream media are the enemy of the people, which is completely untrue. The mainstream media's job is to keep politicians in check and to balance out any kind of mistruths and misinformation that politicians might say. And so for Donald Trump to sort of paint the media as the enemy of the people, the enemy of audiences, aims to increase his own personal influence by silencing or bad-mouthing those who criticize him. As a really extreme example, we can see this happening in other countries that perhaps are not based on a democracy. So right now in China, the ruling party, the People's Republic of China, control all media, including the internet. So despite a lot of negotiations and efforts, Facebook does not have a presence in China. Instead, they have their own social media app called WeChat, and all traditional media is also overlooked and in many cases run by the ruling government, which is the PRC, the People's Republic of China. So as an example of how extreme government control can be in regulating the media, recently all references to Winnie the Pooh have been either filtered or censored by the government. So this resulted because citizens that were quite critical of the leader of China, Xi Jinping, have sort of said that, oh, isn't it funny, he kind of looks like Winnie the Pooh. And this little joke became a real insult to Jinping, and he was really quite outraged by that. So as a result, all references to Winnie the Pooh have been removed from the media. So citizens can't even create a Google search, Google image search for photos of Winnie the Pooh. The latest Disney live-action movie, Christopher Robin, is not being released in China because the government has stopped it in case people use that Winnie the Pooh references to make fun of their leader. So sometimes when we think about media, government control and propaganda and things like that, we think about it in terms of the past. But this is a clear example of how governments today can still be using their position of power to regulate media for a negative effect or for a self-serving effect.